Well, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Walking Through the Scriptures with Joseph Bahoda. I'm doing a video today in response to Allen Parr's video that he made back on August 23rd. So this is like a week ago that he made it and posted it on YouTube. And first of all, I want to give Allen Parr credit on this in the sense that I'm glad he tried to tackle this topic. This really what he's talking about is, does God predestine some people to heaven or others to hell? And what he's basically talking about, now there's nuances to this, and I'm not going to get into all the nuances. But basically when it comes to heaven and hell, there's basically two trains of thought. You have Calvinism versus Arminianism, okay? And what I found out recently in my own personal studies, Arminianism is really what the Eastern Orthodox Church believes too, okay? And for those of you who don't know, in 1054, before 1054, the East and West were together. Now, they had their differences in different things, but they were still united as one church. But in 1054, they're called the Great Schism, the Western Church and the Eastern Church split. So for the most part, in Europe, and then eventually that Christianity from Europe came to America. So all we really know in America is Westernized Christianity or European Christianity, which was Western Christianity, i.e. the Christianity we got from Rome and Europe. Even when Martin Luther came up against the Catholic Church, again, Western Christianity, and it eventually turned into Protestantism, Protestantism is a form of Westernized Christianity too. So whether it's Roman Catholicism or Protestantism, that's still Western Christianity, okay? Well, Western Christianity, a lot of it was adopted by John Calvin, therefore Calvinism, but there was Arminianism in there too. But the East, Eastern Orthodox never adopted Calvinism. And this is something I just researched last night. In 1672, the Eastern Orthodox Church came with a synod, the Synod of Diotheus, if that's how you want to say it. And it's basically a council of bishops that came together in Jerusalem denouncing Reformed theology in the sense of God predestines some to go to heaven and God predestines some to go to hell, which is what they call the doctrine of double predestination, by the way, for those of you who don't know. It's the doctrine of double predestination, means God predestines some to go to heaven and God automatically, before the foundations of the world, predestines some to go to hell, okay? It's called the doctrine of double predestination, which is basically what Calvinism is. Well, the Eastern Orthodox Church denounced that in the Council of Diotheus in Jerusalem in 1672. So the Eastern Orthodox Church, for those of you who don't know, is Arminian, if you will. Okay, and obviously Arminians are Arminians too. So my point to that is this. So when we talk about the history of the church, at least especially here in America, we can't just talk about the history of the church in westernized terms and act like the West is the only source of church history. When we talk about the history of the church, we also have to, whether we agree with everything or not, because I don't agree with everything Eastern Orthodox people say either. However, when you talk about the history of the church, if you want to be fair and not biased, you can't just quote Calvin and Luther and European westernized theologians. When you talk about the history of the church, saints, we have to talk about the history of the church in all the church, not just the West. And this is something you got to understand too. When we talk about the church, when the church basically, going back to the ancient times, there was 5 major hubs of Christianity. And it wasn't just Rome. Rome was just one of them. But you had Rome, you had Alexandria, Egypt, which is in Egypt. You had Jerusalem, you had Antioch, which is modern-day Turkey, and then you had Constantinople, which is now modern-day Istanbul when the Muslims took it over. So you had Constantinople, which is Turkey. You had Antioch, which is Turkey. You had Jerusalem. We all know that's the Middle East, modern-day Israel today. You had Alexandria, which is in Egypt, and then you had Rome, obviously, in Europe. So those were the 5 hubs. Well, technically, the only one in the West there is Rome. The other 4 is Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And I'm doing a severe undersimplification of this. But those were the 5 major hubs, and 4 of them belong to the East, okay? So when you talk about the history of the church, it doesn't do your research any justice, guys, when all you do is just talk about the West. That is only 1/5 of the piece of the pie, if you will. You might want to quote other church scholars in the East, because that's part of the church too. But the problem is so a lot of us, when we quote Reformed theology, or when we quote Calvinism, or even a lot of Protestantism works, we're quoting from the West. We're getting westernized Christianity, which is a very limited, biased, not a full representation of the church's history. So when you say church history, you need to include the history of the East as well, guys. If you want to be fair and balanced, and also too, if you want to have scholastically research in your research, if you want to have a complete work of your research, you better include the history of the East as well. Because if you say this is the history of the church and you don't include the East, you're not giving an accurate picture of the history of the church, is my point. So, with that being said, I applaud Allen Parr for him trying to tackle this. He's basically talking about Calvinism versus Arminianism. However, I have two major points. Now, there's many things that I can really talk about here, but for the sake of time, I have two major points. And I commented on Allen Parr's video. And I'm going to include Allen's video in my video here. Okay? I have two major issues with Allen Parr's video. First of all, I applaud him for tackling Calvinism versus Arminianism. I applaud him for trying to tackle that big task. So kudos to him for trying to tackle it. And he said at the end of his video that he's basically Calvinistic. He believes God does predestine some people to go to heaven, and he does predestine some people to go to hell. But he doesn't say it like that. He basically says God doesn't predestine them to go to hell. God predestines to basically choose to, I don't want to say ignore them, but he chooses to allow them to keep sinning. So basically they send themselves to hell. Well, that's kind of like his out of getting out of double predestination, which I think he shouldn't have done. Look, bro, if you believe in Calvinism, you do believe in double predestination, which means you do believe that God predestines some to go to heaven and he does predestine some people to go to hell. Just admit that, okay? You may not like it, but that's what Calvinism gives you, okay? So if you're going to claim Calvinism, you need to claim all of it, okay? He kind of, in my opinion, wussed out a little bit at the end. Brother, don't wuss out. If you believe in Calvinism, just say you believe God predestines some people to go to hell. Just say it, okay? Number one. But number two, so I guess I have three things that I have. That was number one. I have three things that I have a beef with. Number one, he seemed to kind of wuss out at the end. If you believe in Calvinism, bro, then claim all of it. Whether you like it or not, do it and claim all of it, number one. Number two, I cannot stand his definition of Arminianism. Because he basically said, now granted, I'll admit that Arminianism does have some problems, but just like, to be fair, so does Calvinism, okay? There's some problems with Calvinism too. And for those of you who don't know, I'm Arminian, if you haven't figured that out by now. I'm Arminian, but I'll admit there's some problems with our Arminianism belief, okay? However, it's not what Allen Parr is saying. He basically says the problem with Arminianism is that you're taking credit for your salvation. So consequently, when we get to heaven, we're going to say, well, wow, I'm glad that I was wiser and I was smarter than this other person, and I chose better. They chose to ignore Christ. They chose to reject Christ. I chose to accept Christ. So I so thank God that I made the better choice. Allen, that is not Arminian thought. Arminians believe in it's grace alone, through faith alone, through salvation alone, scripture alone. We believe in the five solas, just like, Martin Luther did, and just like the Calvinists would. The only really main difference is we believe that you have to accept that gift. So this is the way Arminians would say it. We believe that Jesus provided the gift, and he freely gives that gift to all. And oh, by the way, it's a work of Christ. Jesus did all the works. It's not of works that I did. I didn't save myself. I didn't die on the cross. I didn't pay the penalty for my own sin. I didn't do any of that. Jesus did all the work. And since he did all the work, he paid the price. He paid my debt, if you will. He did all the work. And therefore, he presents that gift to all. We just receive it. Okay? So my point is, it's now Eastern Orthodox have a word for this. They call it synergia or synergy. where basically God partners with man and man partners with God to bring about salvation, meaning God presents man with the gift, but man has to receive it. Okay? That's essentially Arminianism. Eastern Orthodox call that synergy. Okay? But it's basically Protestant Arminianism is what it's called. Well, that's been the official stance of the Eastern Orthodox Church since 1672. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm just saying if you're going to cover church history, you need to cover that too, okay? Just so you know. So if you're a Calvinist, I'm not coming up against you. You may be right. I may be wrong, okay? Potato, potato, okay? Whatever. Tomato, tomato. I'm just saying if you're going to cover the history of the church, you need to cover all of it. And in 1672, the Eastern Orthodox Church officially rejected Reformed theology because of this ideology of double predestination. You need to know that if you're going to cover church history, okay? Just saying. So, but I'll admit Calvinism may be right. I may be wrong. But I'm just saying, in fairness, you need to cover it all. So, my point is, Arminians would never say when we get to heaven, man, I so thank God that I was wiser and smarter and I made a better choice than brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so. No, we would say, wow, I so thank God that Christ saved me. Just like a Calvinist would. We don't take credit for accepting Christ. We thank God that God chose us to want to save us. So my point is, we as Arminians, we still give all the credit to God. All the credit belongs to Jesus because Jesus did all the work. He's the one who paid the price. He's the one who presents the free gift of salvation to us. So it's his work. We don't take any credit for it. Now, the reason, and I saw James White's debate with Pastor Mike Winger on this. James White is a staunch Calvinist, for those of you who don't know. And the reason he has a problem with this is because what he says, well, if you accept Christ then it's not 100% grace and it's not 100% faith. It's 99.9% grace and 99.9% faith. But if you have to choose, if you have to accept, then it's not 100% God. There's still a little bit of you in there, and therefore it's 99.9% grace, and therefore 99.9% faith. To me, that's just semantics. I'm sorry. Whether God chose me or I chose him, either way, Jesus still gets all the credit, okay? Because at the end of the day, if it wasn't for Christ doing what he did, we as Arminians couldn't be saved. Just like if you're a Calvinist, if Jesus didn't do what he did, you as a Calvinist wouldn't be saved. So my point is, whether if it's 100% or 99.9%, Jesus still gets the credit, guys. So my point is, when Allen Parr says, when you're Arminian, you're going to say, well, I'm glad I made a better choice than that person. We're not going to say that, Allen. We're going to say all the glory belongs to Christ. Because if it wasn't for Christ, I wouldn't be saved. So thank God Christ saved me. That's what we would say, Allen. I'm sorry. Your presentation of Arminianism there is just really, really bad. It's a very, very bad misrepresentation of Arminian thought. Now, granted, there's some other problems with Arminian thought, and which I'm not going to deal with this in this video, because I'll admit, as an Arminian, we got some problems that we got to deal with. We got some questions that Arminian belief really doesn't answer. I'll admit that, okay? But what you presented, Allen Parr, isn't one of them, okay? It's not one of them. All right, number two. The other problem I have is Allen Parr says his interpretation of Romans 9, when he talks about who he's preparing for salvation and who he's preparing for damnation, if you will. In context, Romans 9 is talking about the salvation of the Jews and how God was somehow, basically Paul is trying to get us, the reader, to understand God's plan for salvation for the Jewish people, i.e. ethnic Jews, okay? Because during the time of Paul's writing, they weren't being saved because they were rejecting Christ, and Paul had a really burden for them why his fellow Jewish brethren weren't being saved, and he had a really strong burden for that. So Romans 9 in context, when it talks about God preparing some for salvation and preparing some for destruction and hardening your heart and all that, he's talking about ethnic Jews. He's talking about Jewish people. Allen, he's not talking about salvation for all of humanity like you presented it in your video. There's a context to that preparation. And that preparedness or that preparation was talking about Jewish people, not salvation for the entire world. Now that changes the context actually quite a bit, depending on how God is talking about that salvation. And it is because Paul is talking about God's plan of how he's going to save some of them Jews later on. So that's the context there, Alan. It's not talking about salvation for all of humanity. It's talking about how God prepares some and how God predestines some not to be saved or not saved. Okay? And it's talking about ethnic Jews, not all of humanity. So that does change the context somewhat, Alan. So again, I can nitpick on some other things, but those are the three things that I have a problem with. One, it seemed like Alan wussed out at the end. Two, horrible representation of Arminian thought. And three, Romans 9 is not talking about salvation for all of humanity. It's talking about salvation for ethnic Jews and how God was Paul was basically laying out his plan for salvation of how God was going to do that. But for them and only them, not all of humanity, Alan. So, yeah, we need to clean that up. So, again, I applaud you for tackling this topic, but there's some things that we need to do, Alan, to clean that up, okay? So this is my response to Allen Parr's video, does God predestine some people to hell and others to heaven? Okay? There's some things that need to be cleaned up there. Anyway, until next time, love you guys. God loves you and I do too. God bless.